Chapter 13. Ahmose and the Morning of Empire. This is the second part of our long journey through the history of ancient Egypt. The first part carried us from the Green Sahara to the divided kingdom, some 15 centuries of river and stone. This part begins in the dark before a sunrise, and it will carry us through Egypt's brightest morning, its long imperial noon, and at last, gently, down the far slope of its extraordinary day, to a queen watching the sea. There is still no rush. Let the world grow quiet again, and let the morning come. We left the two lands divided between three powers, the Hyksos kings in their northern harbor city of Avaris, the kingdom of Kush beyond the southern cataract, and between them, holding the old heartland and the old idea, the little kingdom of Thebes. We left a returned letter in a Hyksos king's hands, a war begun and paused, and a boy inheriting it. Ahmose, son and grandson and nephew of fighting kings, raised by that line of formidable queens who had held the south together through the dangerous years. He came to the throne, it seems, as a child, and so for the first years the kingdom rested where it had rested before, in the hands of a royal woman, his mother, who kept Thebes steady until her son came of age. Egypt would remember her for it. And when Ahmose took up the war himself, a grown man now, he took it up not with fury, but with method, the patient southern method, one move at a time, each move held until it was ready. We can follow the war, remarkably, through the eyes of a man who rode in it. In the tomb of a soldier, also named Ahmose, a ship's officer from the southern town of El Kab, there survives a plain-spoken account of his career, carved in his old age, and it is one of the great first-hand voices of the ancient world. He tells how he served, young and unmarried, on a warship of the king, how the fleet fought on the canals of Avaris itself, how he was decorated, more than once, with the gold of valor, how he was granted land and captives for his service, and rose, ship by ship and reign by reign, from a sailor's hammock to an estate and an honored old age. There is no poetry in his account, and no horror either. Only the long working life of a professional, proud of his record, secure in his rewards. Wars are remembered by kings in proclamations. They are lived by men like Ahmose of El Kab, and it is his voice, matter of fact and unafraid, that carries us through these years. The war ended the way long wars often end, not with one blow, but with a tide. The Theban fleet and army closed on Avaris in campaign after campaign, and at last, around 1550 BC, roughly 3,500 years ago, the great harbor city passed into Ahmose's hands, and the Hyksos power in Egypt was finished. The remnant withdrew northeast along the coastal road, and Ahmose followed, unhurried and thorough, besieging their stronghold beyond the frontier for year upon year until it, too, yielded. Then he turned, marched the whole length of his recovered country, and went south, past the first cataract, to settle accounts with Kush and bring the old frontier forts back under the crown. When he was done, the work of 200 years of patience was complete. The two lands were one land, under one king, for the third great time in this story. But something had changed, and the change would shape the whole age to come. Twice now, Egypt had learned that the valley was not a world unto itself, that power could gather beyond the horizons, north and south, and come in through the doors. The lesson sank deep. The new kingdom would not wait behind its borders and trust the desert to guard it. It would hold the approaches, Nubia to the deep south, garrisoned and governed, the coastal roads and city-states of the Levant, watched, bound by oath, kept from ever again becoming a gathering ground. Egypt would not be caught sleeping again. That, at first, is all that empire meant. It meant holding the porch as well as the house. And to hold it, Egypt kept something it had never kept before: a standing army, professional and permanent, with the chariot at its heart. The horse, that Hyksos novelty which Theban boys had learned in dusty enclosures a generation before, was now simply Egyptian, bred on delta pastures, stabled at royal posts, harnessed in pairs to the light. Fast cars that had become one of the proudest military technologies of the age. A new class grew up around them, the chariot warriors and the master horsemen, young men of good family for whom the army was now a career and a ladder, as the scribal schools had long been. The soldier's life had its songs and its grumbles, its long marches and its garrison years, and the scribes, ever loyal to their own guild, wrote satires warning schoolboys away from it. The soldier, they said, is marched over mountains, eats bread mixed with grit, and aches in every limb, while the scribe sits in the shade and directs him. The satire tells us what the recruiting posters would have told us if Egypt had had them: that the army was everywhere, respected, complained about, and permanent, a fixture of the new age as the pyramid crews had been a fixture of the old. At home, Ahmose rebuilt. The quarries reopened, and the inscriptions record the king's pride in new monuments of gleaming limestone, cedar barges for Amun, furnishings of gold and silver for the temples that had waited out the long division. We may picture what those years of restoration felt like in any temple town along the river. For a generation, the shrine at the heart of the town has made do. The offerings thinner than the old prescriptions asked, the paint fading in the sanctuary, the festival bark patched rather than replaced, the god served faithfully but plainly, the way a family in hard times keeps its holidays small. Now, season by season, the plenty returns. A royal barge comes up the river with new cedar doors, smelling of the far-off mountains, and the whole town turns out to watch them swung into place. Masons arrive with orders and limestone, and the worn thresholds are relaid. The sanctuary is repainted, blue and gold, new linen, new vessels, new incense in quantities the young priests have never seen. And on the morning of the great festival, the god's bark comes out through the new doors, gleaming, carried on the shoulders of the priests through streets packed with people who remember the lean years, and the incense goes up in clouds, and the singers sing the old hymns at full strength, and everyone present understands, without a word of politics, that the world has been set right. Egypt often measured its health in this way, not by borders on a map, but by whether the gods were served in the old fullness, whether the festivals came in their seasons, whether Ma'at, the great order, was being kept. In the reign of Ahmose, town by town, temple by temple, the answer became yes again. He honored his family with the devotion that ran through that remarkable house, raising monuments to his grandmother, the matriarch of the dynasty, simply, as his inscription says, because he loved her. At sacred Abydos, he built the last royal pyramid Egypt would ever raise, so far as we know, a modest monument beside the giants of the past, like a signature closing a very long chapter. The pyramid age had ended where it began, at Abydos, quietly, with honor. For the kings of the new age had chosen a different eternity. They would lie at Thebes, in the West Bank cliffs, and where the old kings had built mountains, the new kings would use one. Behind the great cliff bay, hidden from the river, a dry valley wound among the rocks beneath that natural pyramid-shaped peak we have seen standing over Thebes since chapter 8. And there, beginning in the generations just after Ahmose, the royal tombs went underground. Corridors and stairways and painted halls cut deep into the living stone, their entrances sealed and hidden, guarded not by mass, but by secrecy and by the mountain itself. The place has a modern name now, known around the world: the Valley of the Kings. For nearly 5 centuries, the rulers of Egypt would be carried into that silent valley, one after another, while their temples stood apart on the green plain below, facing the river and the rising sun. And above all, the new age belonged to Amun, the hidden one of Thebes, whom we met as a modest local god in a modest shrine, had kept faith with his city through the long patience, and now his city kept faith with him. Victory, said the kings, had been Amun's gift, so the wealth of victory flowed to Amun's house. At Karnak, on the east bank, reign upon reign now began adding courts and gateways, halls and shrines, obelisks and gardens, each king building in gratitude and in hope, until over the centuries the modest shrine became a city of the god, acre upon acre of columned stone. We will watch it grow for the rest of this story. Its priesthood grew with it, and its estates, and its granaries, and in time that gathered wealth would become a force in the land in its own right. But that is trouble for a distant chapter. In these first bright years, it was simply gratitude, laid course upon course. Ahmose died with the work done, and his son Amenhotep, the first of that great name, inherited a kingdom whole, solvent and at peace, and gave it a long, steady, consolidating reign, the kind of reign that history finds little to say about, and countries find everything to love. He and his mother, the widowed queen, were remembered at Thebes with unusual tenderness. In later generations, the craftsmen of the royal tombs would honor the two of them as the patron spirits of their village, a king and his mother watching over the workmen's houses long after both were gone. Few rulers anywhere have been remembered so, not for conquest, but for keeping. Evening settles over a healed Egypt. At Avaris, the harbor is Egyptian again, and quiet. In the far south, the forts of the cataract keep the crown's watch, as they kept it in the Middle Kingdom. The old dispatches resumed. All is well. At Karnak, the new gateways stand pale in the dusk, smelling of cut stone, and across the river, the hidden valley holds its first royal sleeper beneath the silent peak. The long division is over. The porch is held. The house is swept and lit. Egypt stretches after its long, troubled sleep and finds itself strong, young, and facing a wide-open world. What it does next, and who leads it there, will fill some of the brightest chapters of this whole story. And the first of those chapters belongs, fittingly for this dynasty of formidable women, to a queen who became a king. Chapter 14, Hatshepsut, the queen who was king. The 18th dynasty, in its first century, was a family the like of which Egypt had rarely seen. Vigorous kings, long-lived queens, and a habit of producing, again and again, rulers who seemed equal to the hour. After the consolidating reign of Amenhotep came a soldier king, Thutmose, first of that name, who marched Egypt's new army to distances earlier kings had rarely, if ever, reached, deep into Nubia beyond the Third Cataract, and northeast across the Levant to the banks of the great river Euphrates, where his soldiers, children of a river that flows north, marveled at water that flowed the wrong way, south, and said so on their monuments. He was also, so far as we know, the first king laid to rest in the hidden valley beneath the peak. The pattern of the age was set. The empire abroad, the secret tomb at home, and Amun over all. And into this family, in the height of its confidence, was born a royal daughter named Hatshepsut. She was the daughter of the soldier king, the wife of his successor, and when that successor died young, she found herself, in the familiar way of her dynasty's women, standing beside a throne that held a child, the young Thutmose, third of the name, her stepson and nephew, heir to everything and able, as yet, to rule nothing. So she governed for him, as regent, as her foremothers had governed, and the arrangement stood within a tradition the dynasty knew well. For this family's queens had been holding thrones steady for 100 years. Then, somewhere in the early years of the regency, something changed. She did not seize power in a night. She grew into it, title by title, image by image, and we can watch it happen on the monuments. The queen's titles gathering weight, the regent shone ever more royally, until at last Hatshepsut appears crowned, enthroned, and named as what Egypt scarcely had a word for, a female king, not a queen ruling for another. A pharaoh, reigning in her own right and name, with the young Thutmose beside her as junior partner, acknowledged but junior, for close to 20 years. How she accomplished it, in a kingship so bound to sons and fathers, is a question scholars still turn over, and the monuments give her own answer. Legitimacy, stated calmly and often. She was the great king's daughter, of the purest royal line. More than that, her temple walls declare, she was the daughter of Amun himself, chosen by the god, crowned at his command. On her monuments, she took the full regalia of kingship, and had herself portrayed as tradition demanded a pharaoh be portrayed, in the king's kilt and crowns, sometimes even with the ceremonial false beard, not as disguise but as uniform. The office had one image, and she, being the office, wore it. The Egyptians believed the throne of Horus made whoever sat upon it into something beyond man or woman. Hatshepsut took that belief at its word. What did she do with the power? That is where her reign becomes one of the gentlest great reigns in Egyptian history, and a gift to a series like ours. There were campaigns early on, enough to show the crown's arms still reached, but the signature of her years was not war. It was building and trade and splendor. Peace, too, can be a policy, and she made it one, and Egypt grew rich on it. Her monuments rose all along the river, and at Karnak she raised for Amun a pair of obelisks that still astonish. Single needles of rose granite, each nearly 100 feet of unbroken stone, quarried at Aswan, floated downstream on colossal barges, raised upright by earthen ramps and patience, their pyramid tips sheathed in fine gold to throw the sunrise across Thebes. It is worth pausing on what such a thing asked of its makers, because the asking was the point. Granite is among the hardest stones Egypt worked, and at Aswan the quarrymen freed each obelisk from the living rock not with chisels, but with pounding, rank upon rank of men crouched along the trench lines, striking down hour after hour with handheld balls of dolerite, a stone even harder than granite, wearing the channel deeper by dust and persistence, to the slow, communal rhythm of work songs for month upon month. The great needle had to come free perfect. A single deep crack and years of labor stayed in the ground forever, and at Aswan today there still lies an unfinished obelisk, larger than any ever raised, abandoned in its trench when the stone betrayed it, a monument, in its own way, as eloquent as any that stood. When a needle did come free, it traveled to the river on sledges and rollers, was drawn aboard a barge built for nothing else, among the largest vessels of the age, and went down the summer flood to Thebes with escorting boats around it, like a state procession, which is what it was. The Queen's reliefs show the voyage proudly. Then the ramps, the ropes, the counterweights, the one unforgiving day of the raising, and at last the gilded tip taking the sunrise. The Egyptians believed an obelisk was a frozen ray of the sun, a petrified beam of the first light. Watching one made, month by patient month, her subjects would have understood the other thing it was, proof that the hand that ruled Egypt, whoever's hand it might be, could still command the oldest and greatest of Egypt's powers, the power of many people, working a long time, together. One of them stands today, the tallest ancient obelisk still standing on Egyptian soil. On its base she left an inscription almost disarming in its directness, saying, in effect, "You who see this in after years and wonder, know that I did this for my father Amun, and my heart urged me to it, and it is true." And in the great cliff bay of the West Bank, beside the terraced temple of Amenhotep the Uniter, 5 centuries old by her day and venerable, she kept the promise this series made in Chapter 9. She built her own temple there, in open homage to his, terrace answering terrace, and surpassed her model with extraordinary grace. Her temple climbs the bay in 3 broad colonnaded tiers, joined by long ramps, its porticos light and rhythmic against the golden cliff. Garden courts at its feet, where myrrh trees stood in pits of earth. Of all the monuments in Egypt, it is perhaps the most serene architecture in the key of this series. Horizontal, patient, and in conversation with its landscape. Its ancient name was Djeser-Djeseru, the Holy of Holies. Morning still fills it the way it filled Mentuhotep's bay, like a bowl. On its walls she carved the deeds she counted highest, and the place of honor went not to a battle but to a voyage. In her 9th year, Hatshepsut sent a fleet of 5 ships south down the Red Sea to the land of Punt, the far incense country that Egypt had known in old tales and rare expeditions, a place of myrrh and gold at the edge of the known world. The reliefs at her temple follow the whole journey like a picture story, and we can follow it with them. The ships run south under sail and oar, fish carved swimming beneath their keels. They anchor off a village of dome-shaped houses raised on stilts among the incense trees, where the people of Punt come down to the shore in wonder, led by their chief and his wife. There is no conquest in the pictures. There is commerce and courtesy. The Egyptians spread out their trade goods, and the loading begins. And what a loading it is. Sacks of fragrant myrrh resin, ebony and ivory, gold, leopard skins, live apes and hunting dogs, and, most wonderful of all, 31 living myrrh trees, dug up root and soil, carried aboard in baskets slung on poles between porters. The reliefs show the fleet coming home heavy laden. The the trees planted in the garden court of the temple itself, incense of punt growing in Egyptian earth for Amun's pleasure. The queen-king counted it among the glories of her reign, and the walls say why. The like of this, they declare, had never been brought back for any king since the beginning, so far as the ancients could recall. It is the happiest expedition in Egyptian art, remembered not for what it destroyed, but for what it carried carefully home alive. Beside her, through these years, stood a remarkable commoner, Senenmut, steward of her estates, tutor to her daughter, overseer of her works, a man of modest birth and enormous ability, who collected offices the way other men collected titles of honor, and whose name is fixed forever to the building of the great temple. Later ages have loved to speculate about the queen and her minister. The sober truth is that we do not know, and the speculation tells us more about later ages than about them. What the monuments show is trust, publicly given, and talent, publicly rewarded, in the best tradition of Imhotep. The reign ran on, prosperous and building, for over 2 decades in all, and then Hatshepsut died, in what we would call her middle years, and was laid, as a king, in the Valley of the Kings. Thutmose III, a grown man long since, and by every later sign a capable and patient one, took up sole rule at last, and of him the next chapter will have much to say. One shadow crosses the story afterward, and honesty asks us to look at it calmly. Late in Thutmose's long reign, a quiet order went out, and workmen moved through the monuments of Egypt, chiseling Hatshepsut's royal names and images away, walling up her obelisks, recarving her figure into kings safely male and safely dead. For a long time this was told as hatred, the stepson's revenge. But the timing tells against the old tale. The erasures began, so far as the evidence shows, only decades after her death, when hatred would have long cooled, and they were curiously incomplete, sparing her images as queen while targeting her images as king. Most scholars now read it not as rage, but as bookkeeping of the coldest dynastic kind, a tidying of the record late in the day, so that the kingship would pass down the generations as an unbroken line of fathers and sons, with no female king to complicate the succession. If so, it failed in the most fitting way possible. The walls of Djeser kept her story under the plaster. The foundation deposits kept her name. And when the modern age learned to read hieroglyphs again, Hatshepsut rose out of the erasure like her own obelisk out of its walling, and stands now among the most famous rulers Egypt ever had. Stone, in Egypt, has a long memory, and it kept its promise to her. A name carved is a person remembered. Evening comes to the Bay of Cliffs, as we have watched it come before. The light leaves the valley floor, climbs the 3 bright terraces one by one, and holds last on the golden rock above. In the garden court, we may imagine, the myrrh trees of Punt breathe their sweetness into the cooling air, 500 miles from the sea they crossed. 2 temples stand side by side in the dusk, the Uniters and the Queen Kings, 5 centuries between them, terrace answering terrace, patience answering patience. She proved that the throne of Egypt was larger than anyone had guessed. Now her stepson would prove how far its reach could run. The horizon is about to widen, and we follow it next. Chapter 15, Thutmose III and the Widening Horizon. Every spring, when the harvest was in and the roads of the north were dry, Egypt marched. That is the rhythm of this chapter, and we will keep it as the age kept it, not as the crash of battles, but as the long, patient breathing of an empire. Muster in the delta as the fields empty, the dusty column moving up the coastal road, chariots and baggage trains and boys driving remount horses, 10 miles a day, 15 on the good stretches. Summer among the hill towns and the treaty cities, and home down the same road before the water rises, in time for the festivals. The army paid, and the temples fed, and the wide world reminded, once again, of the order of things. Year upon year upon year, it is possible to conquer an empire loudly. Thutmose III mostly did it the way Egypt did everything at its best, on schedule. He had waited a long time for the work, junior king through 2 decades of Hatshepsut's building and trading, and whatever he privately made of those years, they gave him a grown man's readiness on the day sole rule finally came. He would need it, for the news from the north came quickly. The princes of the Levant, testing the new reign as borderlands always test a new reign, had gathered in coalition at a fortress town called Megiddo, where the hill roads met the Great Plain, intending, at the least, to close Egypt's road north. Megiddo commanded the junction of the ways. Whoever held it held the door to Syria. The new king mustered the army and went up the coastal road to answer, and what happened next was remembered in Egypt for centuries, because the king ordered the campaign recorded, day by day, from the field scribe's own journal, and had the record carved at Karnak. Thanks to that, this is one of the earliest military campaigns in history that we can follow, march by march, decision by decision, from the words of people who were there. The famous moment of the campaign was a choice about roads. 3 routes led over the ridge to Megiddo, 2 easy, wide, and watched, and 1 straight through the hills, a narrow pass where the army would have to go, as the scribes wrote, horse behind horse and man behind man, the column strung out and vulnerable for hours. The council of officers, sensible men, urged either of the safe roads. The king heard them out and chose the narrow one, reasoning, so the record says, that the enemy would reason exactly as his own officers had, and would watch the sensible roads. Then he did the thing the scribes clearly loved best, and put himself at the head of the column, first through the pass. The gamble read the enemy correctly. The army came out of the hills unopposed, formed up on the plain by the town, and in the battle that followed, the coalition broke quickly and fled inside the walls. There followed, less gloriously, a long summer's siege, for which the scribes half apologize. But when Megiddo yielded, the whole coalition yielded with it, princes and oaths and tribute together, and the king's summary sentence went into the annals and into history. The capture of Megiddo, he said, was the capture of 1,000 towns. That sentence is the key to the whole reign, because it tells us what Thutmose actually wanted, and it was not rubble. But before the system, stay a while with the marching, because the marching is where this empire actually lived, and it suits the pace of our telling. An Egyptian field army on the northern road was a moving town. The chariotry and the infantry companies with their standards, the baggage donkeys in their hundreds, herdsmen driving the meat supply on the hoof, armorers and grooms and cooks, scribes with the muster rolls, priests with a portable shrine so the god could travel with his army. It moved at the pace of its slowest cart, and its days had a shape as fixed as a farmer's. break camp in the gray first light, the cool hours for the hard miles, the halt at the height of the day, water and shade where the route men had marked them, the animals seen to first, as always and everywhere, the afternoon miles slower, and then the evening ritual that every soldier of every age would recognize, the site chosen near water, the lines laid out, the fires lit, the rations issued, the sentries posted, and the vast foreign night coming down over rows of tents, with the smell of wood smoke and horses, and somewhere a man singing a song about a girl at home in the delta, in a hill country whose stars sat differently in the sky. Egypt's empire was won less by its battles, which were few, than by its logistics, which were ceaseless. The granaries at the frontier posts, the water dumps along the desert road, the harbor magazines the Navy kept filled, all the unglamorous arithmetic that let a moving town appear under the walls of a Levantine city on schedule year after year, until appearing was usually enough. What Egypt built across the next 20 years, and some 17 campaigns, most of them marches more than battles, was not a smoking conquest, but a system. The city-states of the Levant left standing, under their own princes, bound by oath to the crown, paying yearly tribute, watched from a handful of Egyptian garrisons and harbor posts along a coast the Egyptian navy now used like a highway, supply ships shadowing the army's marches. And one instrument of the system deserves special notice, because it shaped a whole generation of the ancient world. The sons of the vassal princes came to Egypt. Hostages in the cold accounting, but raised warmly, educated at the palace beside the children of Egyptian nobles, schooled in Egyptian letters and manners and loyalties, and then, when their fathers died, sent home to rule as princes who had grown up Egyptian. It was empire by patience, the long game played with children in schoolrooms rather than fire, and it held the north, with maintenance, for generations. The tribute flowed south in a river of its own, silver and cedar, copper and horses, oils and wine, lapis from beyond the Euphrates, and the yearly wealth of Nubia's gold from the empire's other arm, which the king extended deep past the Fourth Cataract, where a governor now ruled the southern lands for the crown from beneath the holy mountain of Gebel Barkal. Karnak swelled with the giving. And here the rain shows the trait that makes this warrior king so unexpectedly good company for a series like ours. What he chose to commemorate. At Karnak, in a quiet chamber behind the sanctuary, he had his artists carve not piles of weapons, but a garden. Wall upon wall of the plants, flowers, birds, and beasts his campaigns had encountered in Syria and beyond. Carefully observed, lovingly detailed, strange lilies and unfamiliar fruits, birds of other latitudes, each rendered like a specimen in a collector's album. Scholars call it the botanical garden. The king of the widest world Egypt had yet claimed, wanted it recorded that the world was not only conquerable, but interesting. Marching over the earth, he had noticed it, and brought home seeds and saplings for the gods' gardens, foreign trees to grow in Theban earth beside Hatshepsut's myrrh. We may picture the return that closed each campaigning year, since the age itself loved the scene. The fleet standing into Thebes on the rising water, low-laden, the crews brown from the northern summer. The unloading at Amun's quays, cedar beams and jars of oil, chests and bales, foreign princes' sons gawking at their new home. The whole cargo walked in procession through the town to the temple, to be counted into the gods' books by unhurried scribes, item by item, while the crowds lined the way as crowds always have, to see the strange goods and the stranger animals, and to feel, in the cool of the year, at the center of the world. Then the festivals, the army dispersing to its villages for the winter, the king to his building works and his councils, and in the spring, the muster again. An empire at bottom is a very long supply line, renewed annually. For decades, under this king and his successors, the renewal held. Thutmose reigned, counting the years beside Hatshepsut, for more than 5 decades in all, and died old, full of honors, and was laid in the hidden valley in a tomb whose walls carry the netherworld texts, drawn spare and elegant, like the field journals of one last campaign. Egypt remembered him as long as Egypt remembered anything. The later ages ranked him among the greatest of all who ever wore the 2 crowns, and modern historians, groping for a comparison, have reached for the greatest generals of other civilizations. The comparison this series prefers is quieter and belongs to his own country. He was the flood. He went out every year on schedule. He reached everywhere. He returned bearing riches, and he left behind him, wherever he had passed, not wreckage, but a deposit on which things could grow. Evening comes over the widened world. From the 4th cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, an area no single power had ever watched before, so far as Egypt knew. The same king's name stands on the boundary markers, and between those markers the roads are, for this era and by its standards, safe. In a Levantine hill town, a prince who learned his letters at Thebes seals a tribute list, and, we may imagine, thinks briefly, not unkindly, of the palace schoolroom of his boyhood. At Gebel Barkal, the holy mountain holds the last light above the southern river. At Karnak, the lamps are lit in the chamber of the carved garden, where the strange flowers of Syria bloom in the stone, in the dark, unfading. The horizon has widened nearly as far as Egypt will ever carry it. Now the empire's harvest years begin, and Egypt enters one of the longest golden afternoons of its history, the age of the dazzling sun. Chapter 16, Amenhotep III, the dazzling sun. Between the conqueror and the dazzling sun, 2 reigns kept the great machine turning, a strong-armed son and then a grandson, and from the grandson's days comes one small story too good to march past, for it happened, of all places, at Giza, beneath the chin of the Sphinx. By this age the Sphinx was already more than 1,000 years old, and the desert had drifted in around it, until the great lion lay buried to the neck, a colossal head, watching the sunrise over a sea of sand. And the story, carved on a granite slab that stands between the statue's paws to this day, tells how a young prince of the royal house, hunting in the desert as young men will, lay down at midday to rest in the Sphinx's shadow, and slept and dreamed. In the dream, the Sphinx spoke to him as a father speaks, promising him the 2 crowns of Egypt and asking in return one kindness. Free me from the sand that presses upon me. The prince awoke and remembered, and when in time he became king as Thutmose IV, he cleared the sand from the great body and set up the stone that tells the tale. Scholars read the inscription carefully, as they should, for a prince with a god's personal promise had answers to questions we cannot ask. But as a story of Egypt, it is perfect. the monument already immemorially old, the young man asleep in its shade at noon, the bargain of care for blessing, and the sand, patient as ever, always waiting to return. The dreamer's son was Amenhotep, third of that name, and with him this series reaches the reign it might have been designed for. He came to the throne around 1390 BC, roughly 3,400 years ago, a boy inheriting the mightiest and richest realm in the world Egypt knew, at peace, feared, and solvent beyond counting. He inherited a world at peace, and he spent it magnificently. For nearly 4 decades, almost nothing happened in the way history books usually reckon happening. No great wars, no crises, no convulsions, and everything happened in the way this series reckons it. Building, festival, art, abundance, the high afternoon of an entire civilization, so bright that the ages after would squint back at it. The reign announced its character early, and in a curiously modern way, by news bulletin. The young king had large stone scarabs carved by the 100, inscribed with royal announcements, and sent throughout the realm, and their surviving texts read like the proclamations of a court utterly confident of its audience's interest. The king has taken in marriage the lady Taye, says the great marriage scarab, and names her parents, who were not royal at all, but respectable provincial gentry, and declares her titles. She is the wife of the mighty king, whose empire runs from Syria to the deep south. Another scarab announces the tally of a wild bull hunt. Another, that in his first 10 years, the king took 102 lions with his own bow. So the text declares, and royal hunt tallies are royal hunt tallies in every age. And one, most charming of all, announces a gift. The king has caused a pleasure lake to be made for Queen Tai in her hometown, over a mile long, dug in a matter of weeks, and opened it by sailing across it in the royal barge, whose name that season was the Aten Gleams. The sun disk shines. Remember that barge's name. It is a small cloud, no bigger than a man's hand, on the most brilliant horizon in Egyptian history. Ta herself is one of the great presences of the age. Commoner born, she appears beside her husband with a prominence few queens had ever had, her name joined to his on monuments and state documents, her face in the surviving portraits, intelligent, firm, and slightly amused. The face of a woman who knows exactly how the household runs. Foreign kings, writing to Egypt, knew to reckon with her. After her husband's death, at least one wrote to her directly, urging her to vouch for old friendships to her son, saying, in effect, "You know better than anyone what was said between us." In the dynasty of formidable women, she stands with the foremost. We can hear those foreign kings, and this is one of the marvels of the age. By happy accident of preservation, a whole file of the court's international correspondence survives. Hundreds of clay tablets written in the Babylonian language that was the diplomatic tongue of the era. Letters between Pharaoh and the kings of Babylon and Mitanni, Assyria, the Hittites, and the busy princes of the Levantine coast. They call each other brother. They marry each other's daughters, with dowries and gift lists solemnly itemized. They complain endlessly and wonderfully about the quality of gifts, about slighted messengers kept waiting for years, about chariots and lapis and the exact fineness of gold. And through them all runs one refrain from the foreign side, half compliment and half hint, repeated so often it becomes almost a chorus. Send more gold, brother. for in your land gold is as plentiful as dust. That is what the world said about Egypt in this reign. And Egypt, unfailingly courteous, sent gold, and daughters were not sent in return. For Pharaoh's daughters did not marry abroad, and the letters grumble about that too. It was an international order of gifts and marriages, jealousies and honorifics, held together less by armies than by the steady gravitational pull of Egyptian wealth. Diplomacy was cheaper than war, and far more comfortable, and this king made it a fine art. The wealth had somewhere to go, and it went into stone and splendor on a scale even Egypt had rarely seen. On the Theban east bank, south of Karnak, the king raised the Luxor temple in the honey-colored sandstone of this age, with its deep colonnade of papyrus columns that stands among the most graceful passages of architecture Egypt ever produced. Joined to Karnak by a processional avenue for the great festival in which Amun himself journeyed south in gilded splendor once a year, the whole city following in carnival. That festival deserves a moment of our evening, for it was the high holiday of the Theban year and one of the great recurring joys of the age. Once a year, at the season of the flood, the god came out of his sanctuary. The priests bore the sacred bark of Amun on their shoulders, its cabin veiled, its fittings blazing, out through the pylons of Karnak into the daylight and the roar of the crowds, and carried it, with the barks of his consort and his son, in slow procession south to Luxor, some by the garlanded avenue, some years by river in the great gilded towboats, hauled against the current by crews who counted the labor a blessing. The whole city kept holiday. Soldiers and acrobats and musicians in the procession, incense in clouds, bread and beer given out in festival plenty. The banks lined deep with people who had waited all year for exactly this. We may imagine a Theban child of the rain, hoisted on a father's shoulders at the water's edge, seeing the gold flash on the river through the crowd, the sound of the sistrums and the singers arriving before the boats, and the strange, thrilling knowledge that the god himself, the hidden one, was passing by, hidden even now inside his shining cabin, close enough to feel. At Luxor, the god rested some days in the deep colonnaded halls, the rites within renewing the king and the kingship and the great order of the world. And then the procession returned as it had come, and the city gave itself one more day of holiday, and the year settled back into its furrow with everything, visibly and audibly and deliciously, right. Every age of Egypt had kept festivals. This age could afford to keep them like this. Across the river, he built his own mortuary temple, vaster, the records suggest, than any yet raised in Egypt, fronted by two seated colossi of the king, each cut from a single block and standing, with their crowns, some 60 feet tall. The temple behind them, built too near the flood for eternity, was quarried away by later kings, and the plain took back its fields. But the two colossi kept their seats, and sit there still, enormous, weathered, featureless, facing the sunrise across the green, among the most haunting of all Egyptian monuments, precisely because the splendor they announced has gone back into the land behind them. Later ages would tell strange and lovely tales about them. They have watched more than 3,000 harvests come and go at their feet. And on the west bank rose something Egypt had not quite seen before. Malkata, a whole royal city of pleasure. A rambling palace complex of painted mud brick with its own artificial harbor connected to the river. Its walls and floors, recovered in fragments, were painted not with wars, but with life. Marsh scenes, flights of ducks rising from papyrus, calves leaping, garlands, vine leaves, the blue lake water itself rendered rippling underfoot, so that the court walked, as it were, upon the surface of the marsh in the cool of painted rooms. There the king kept his jubilees in his final decade, festivals of renewal celebrated with an extravagance the officials who organized them recorded with awe, the court afloat on the harbor in gilded barges, the old king enthroned in ceremony after ceremony as the dazzling sun of a world that could not imagine itself otherwise. In those last years, the records show the king increasingly devoted to the sun in all its forms and names. The oldest royal god of Egypt, honored now with a warmth that edged toward something more personal. Among the sun's many aspects, one term appears more and more in the rain's language, on the barge, in building names, in titles, the Aten, the visible disk itself, the plain bright circle in the sky that shines on every land alike. In this reign, it was one strand of devotion among many, at home in the crowded, tolerant Egyptian heaven. The old gods kept their temples and their festivals, and Amun kept his primacy, and no one, so far as we can tell, saw anything coming. The king grew old and heavy and ailing, as even dazzling suns do. And when he died, after 38 years of almost unbroken gold, he was mourned across an international world that had known no other Egypt, and the throne passed to his son, a prince also named Amenhotep, thoughtful, singular, and devoted, beyond all his fathers, to that plain, bright circle in the sky. Evening comes to Malkata, the long way we like it to come. The painted rooms dim, the ducks in the marsh scenes fold into shadow. On the great artificial harbor the last ripples settle, and the gilded barge rides motionless at its moorings, its name fading into the dusk. The Aten gleams. Across the plain, the two colossi hold the afterglow longest, as they always will. The empire is quiet from the fourth cataract to the sea. The granaries are full past counting. The letters of the brother kings lie answered in the archive. The festivals have all been kept. Egypt had rarely been richer and rarely calmer, and the sun had seldom seemed kinder. But the son now coming to the throne has been watching that sun with different eyes, and what he sees in it will carry Egypt, for one strange and luminous generation, somewhere it has never been. That story, the story of the Horizon City, is where we go next. Chapter 17, Akhenaten and the City of the Horizon. Every long story earns one chapter unlike all the others. This is that chapter, one of the strangest and brightest interludes in the whole 3,000 years of Egypt, a generation in which one man tried to turn one of the oldest civilizations on earth toward a single point of light, and the desert kept the record. The new king began conventionally enough. He was crowned as Amenhotep, fourth of the name, son of the dazzling sun and Queen Tiye. And for a few years the monuments show a familiar young pharaoh doing familiar things. But the devotion we watched gathering at the end of his father's reign, the devotion to the Aten, the plain visible disk of the sun, did not stay in the background where Egyptian piety had always kept room for everything. It grew. It moved to the center. And then it moved everything else out. Within a few years, the young king did something startlingly public and theological. He changed his name. Amenhotep, which means Amun is content, became Akhenaten, which speaks instead of the Aten, of being effective for the sun disk, and the change announced everything that followed. For the king had come to believe, with unusual intensity and originality of mind, that the divine was not a crowded household of gods with animal heads and rival priesthoods and mythologies tangled like riverweed. The divine was one thing, and it was overhead, in plain sight, every day. The sun, the disk, the light itself, Father of all lands and all peoples, giver of every living thing. His artists were given a new image for it, and it remains one of the most striking religious images ever devised. The simple circle of the sun, its rays drawn as long, slender arms reaching down, each ray ending in a small, open hand, offering life to the king and the queen and, through them, to the world. Not a man, not a beast, not an idol in the dark of a shrine. Light with hands. And to serve this god of the open sky, the king did the boldest thing of all. He left. He left Thebes, city of Amun, city of his fathers, with its wealth and its priesthoods and its 1,000 years of habit. And he sailed downstream to a place in Middle Egypt, where the eastern cliffs stand back from the river in a great half-circle of empty desert, a bay of land that belonged, he declared, to no god and no man, so that the Aten might have it entire. On its boundaries he carved great stelae into the living rock, recording his oath in his own vivid words. Here he would build the horizon of the Aten. Here it would stand, and he would not pass beyond these markers. This ground was the disk's forever. And then, on the empty gravel, with the speed of a king who felt time pressing, he built a city. We know that city unusually well for ancient Egypt, better in some ways than Thebes or Memphis, and for a melancholy reason that is also a gift, because it was lived in so briefly and then abandoned, no later ages built over it. Under the sand, the archaeologists found a whole capital lying where it fell asleep. The plan of its streets, the villas of its officials with their gardens and shrines, the workshops of its sculptors, the modest terraces of its workmen, the bakeries, the wells, the chapels, the rubbish heaps with their broken wine jar labels still legible, vintage by vintage. Perhaps 20 or 30,000 people followed their king to the horizon city, and for a single generation, it was the capital of the greatest power in the world Egypt knew. We may picture a morning there, in the city's brief, high summer. First light comes over the eastern cliffs, the cliffs the whole city faces, and strikes the white walls while the river mist still lies on the fields to the west. The king's chariot comes up the great central avenue at speed, for this king loved to drive, gleaming in electrum with the queen beside him and outrunners jogging alongside. The daily royal progress from the northern palace down to the temples, itself a kind of liturgy, where older kings appeared to their people in shrines and windows. This one showed himself in motion, in the open, under the disk. Along the avenue the city is waking. Water carriers at the wells, the smell of baking from 100 courtyards, clerks walking to the records office with their pallets, a sculptor's apprentice sweeping stone dust from a doorway into the bright street. In the great open temple, the offering tables are being heaped, and the sun climbs, and the city that has no shadowed sanctuary anywhere in it goes about its business in full light, new, planned, confident, and though no one in the morning crowds could know it, provisional. A capital with a single lifetime, morning, noon, and dusk. At its heart stood the great temple of the Aten, and it was everything Karnak was not. Karnak's holiness deepened inward, hall behind hall, into dimness and mystery. The Aten's temple was a vast open court under the whole width of the sky, unroofed from end to end, filled not with one hidden shrine but with hundreds upon hundreds of open-air altars, heaped on festival days with bread and flowers, fruit and incense, offered in full daylight to the light itself. We heard this idea before long ago in Chapter 7, in the sun courts of the Old Kingdom, and the king knew his history. He was reaching back past Amun, past Thebes, past 1,000 years of accumulation, toward the oldest and simplest devotion Egypt had, and pushing it further than anyone ever had. Worship in the horizon city meant standing in the sun. The art of the place matched the faith, and it startles to this day. Egyptian royal art had always shown kings as serene, muscled, and interchangeable, gods in stone. Akhenaten's sculptors, at his evident command, threw the formula away. They showed the king as he apparently wished to be seen, long-faced, heavy-hipped, strange and unforgettable, and more tenderly, they showed something royal art had scarcely ever shown before: family life. The king and Queen Nefertiti side by side, informal, her arm through his, the royal couple playing with their small daughters, the girls climbing on their parents' laps, reaching for an earring, being kissed. The whole family together under the disk, its small hands of light touching each of them. Nefertiti herself stands beside the king everywhere in the city's art, offering to the Aten in her own right, prominent beyond almost any queen before her. Her painted portrait bust, found fallen in a sculptor's abandoned workshop in the ruined city, has become one of the most recognized faces surviving from the ancient world, serene under her tall blue crown, 3,300 years young. And the faith had its poetry. In the tombs of the city's officials was carved a long hymn to the Aten, composed, the courtiers claimed, by the king himself, and whether or not the claim is literally true, the voice is unlike anything else in Egypt. We may hear a little of its spirit, in paraphrase. You rise in beauty in the horizon of the sky, it says, and every land wakes. Men rise and wash and dress and lift their arms to your light. The birds fly up from their nests praising. The fish leap in the river before you. The chick cries inside the egg, and you give it breath. You made the far lands too, and gave every people their place and their speech and their skins. You set a Nile in the sky for the foreign hills, falling as rain, and the true Nile below for Egypt. How many are your works, it says, hidden from our faces? It is a hymn with almost no mythology in it at all, no battles of gods, no underworld, only the world itself, observed with delight, and the light that makes it live. Readers ever since have noticed how closely its spirit can echo later songs from other lands, and scholars debate the connections cautiously. What no one debates is the tenderness of the eye behind it. If the story ended there, it would be only luminous. It does not end there, and we will keep our habit of honesty quietly. The Aten's rise was not merely an addition. Late in the reign, it became a subtraction. The temples of the old gods, and above all of Amun, were closed, their estates redirected, their festivals stilled, and squads of workmen were sent through the land to chisel Amun's very name from the monuments, high and low, even from the tops of obelisks, even, at times, from the small belongings of ordinary people. For the first time in its long story, Egypt had a ruler who said not only this god is greatest, but the others are not to be spoken. However bright the hymn, the silence it imposed was real, and the land, which had prayed in 10,000 shrines to a whole beloved crowded heaven of protectors, midwife goddesses and household spirits, Osiris of the beautiful West, felt that silence in its bones. The Egyptians believed, as deeply as they believed anything, that safety lay in the fullness of the divine order, everything in its place. The Horizon City asked them to live on one note, however pure. Beyond the royal court, so far as we can tell, very few ever truly did. In the workmen's houses of the Horizon City itself, the little household gods have been found, kept quietly all along. The end came the way ends often come in this story, not with an event, but with an accumulation. The records of the reign's last years grow thin and puzzling. Great names fade from the inscriptions one by one. Some of the royal daughters die young, and there are signs, debated by scholars, that pestilence moved through the wider world in just these years. The diplomatic letters from abroad speak of it. Nefertiti disappears from the record, or as some scholars read the evidence, rises in it, elevated to reign beside the king or even briefly after him under other names. The truth is genuinely uncertain, and honesty prefers the uncertainty. Akhenaten died after 17 years on the throne and was laid, as his oath required, in a tomb in the eastern cliffs of his own city, facing the sunrise he had loved beyond everything. And then, within a very few years, the Horizon City fell quiet. The court departed, the offices closed, the sculptors packed the tools of their workshops and left what was unfinished where it lay. The mud brick began its slow surrender. The sand came in from the desert bay, unhurried, the way we have watched it come since the first chapter, and drifted through the painted rooms, and filled the open courts of the roofless temple, and lay down over the whole bright experiment like evening snow. The Aten still rose each morning over the half-circle of cliffs. It shone now on stillness. He had asked, in his hymn, "How many are your works, hidden from our faces?" For 3,000 years, his city was one of them. What Egypt did next, how it came home to its old gods behind a boy king with a golden face, is the next quiet turning of our story. Chapter 18, The Boy King and the Restoration. Rivers that are turned from their beds, if the ground remembers, find their way back. This chapter is the story of a river returning, of how Egypt, after its one generation at the horizon, came home to itself, and of the boy on whose small shoulders the homecoming rested, a minor king by every ancient measure, who would become, by the strangest road in all this story, the most famous pharaoh in modern imagination. He was a child of the Horizon City, born in its bright years and named for its god, Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten. He was, most scholars conclude, Akhenaten's son. He came to the throne at perhaps 8 or 9 years old. In the uncertain aftermath we watched at the end of the last chapter, married to a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, a girl not much older than himself, and around the two children stood the grown men of the old establishment, the generals and stewards and priests who had bent with the Aten wind and were ready now to bend back. The restoration, when it came gently, at least on the surface of the record, and the ground itself confirms the sequence. Within a few years, the court had left the Horizon City. The boy's name was changed, as his father's had been, but in the opposite direction, Tutankhaten becoming Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, and a great stela was set up at Karnak in the young king's name, telling the official story of the dark time now ended. The temples of the gods, it says, had fallen into neglect from the delta to the marshes of the south, their shrines gone to ruin, their courts a trodden path. The gods had turned their backs upon the land. Prayers went unanswered. But now the king has restored them. Images of gold and precious stone made new, priesthoods re-established, offerings doubled, the boats of the gods built afresh in cedar. That is the restoration, as the restorers told it, a proclamation with a point to make, and we hear it as such. But beneath the official thunder, the substance was real and, for most of Egypt, surely felt as plain relief. The festivals came back. The processions came out of the temple doors again. The little gods returned to their niches in 10,000 kitchens, no longer quietly but by right, and the great crowded heaven of Egypt was declared open, all of it as before. The record shows the policy clearly. What ordinary people felt in every town is harder to hear, though relief surely was much of it. The river was back in its bed. Of the boy king's own reign there is, in truth, not much history to tell, and what there is mostly gentle. A decade of mending, guided by his ministers, the court settled again at Memphis and Thebes, the empire's northern affairs taken in hand by his general, the workshops busy. The most touching objects of the reign are domestic, the furniture and keepsakes made for the young royal couple, chairs and chests and lamps ornamented with small scenes of the two of them together, the queen tying a necklace for the king, offering him flowers, anointing him. Scenes in the warm, intimate manner the Horizon City's art had taught Egypt, and which Egypt, whatever else it repudiated, quietly kept. Then, after 9 or 10 years on the throne, still in his late teens, Tutankhamun died. Why, we cannot say for certain. His mummy has been examined by every method modern science has brought to it, and the scans show a young man frail in some respects, with an injured leg near the time of death. But the examiners themselves disagree, and honesty rests with them. From the anxious weeks that followed, one strange document survives, and it deserves its moment, for nothing else in the age is quite like it. In the archives of the Hittite kings, Egypt's great rivals in the north, a royal annal records that a letter arrived from Egypt, from a queen newly widowed. "My husband has died," she wrote, "and I have no son. They say your sons are many. Send me one, and I will make him my husband, and he will be king of Egypt. For I will not take a servant of mine and make him my husband." The Hittite king, astonished and suspecting a trap, sent an envoy to verify. A second letter came, wounded in tone, insisting, and a prince was at last dispatched south toward the greatest marriage the ancient world could have imagined. He never arrived. He died on the journey, how, the sources do not say, and the affair sank into the diplomatic dark. Scholars still weigh which widowed queen of these tangled years wrote the letters, with the boy king's young widow the leading candidate, and there our knowledge honestly ends. 2 letters, a dead prince, and a silence. What the episode leaves behind, for our story, is the human note under the dynastic one. Somewhere in the palace at the heart of the restored kingdom, a young woman who had already buried most of her family looked at her choices and reached in secret for the widest door she could imagine. It did not open. History closed quietly over the attempt, and over her. Her name fades from the record soon after, and we do not know her end. What is certain is only the fact of the king's death, and the hurry it caused. A king dead with no heir, a tomb not ready. He was buried west of Thebes in the hidden valley, in a tomb small for a king, likely borrowed from a lesser destiny and hastily made royal. Its 4 little rooms packed almost to the ceilings with everything a king's eternity required. The gilded shrines and couches, the chariots taken apart to fit, the chests of linen, the food and wine, the childhood keepsakes, the golden mask upon his face. The old ritual words were spoken. The door was sealed and the seals stamped. The workmen swept the corridor behind them, and within a few generations, floods had washed debris over the entrance. Later workmen had built their huts on top of it, and the small tomb of the minor king passed out of the memory of the world. Hold that image, the sealed door under the rubble, and let the story go on above it. Because the story is not done arranging its ironies. The boy was succeeded briefly by the old courtier Ai, and then by the general, Horemheb, a strong administrator who ruled long and well, reformed abuses with a famous edict against corrupt officials, and completed the restoration in the thorough Egyptian manner, which we have met before. He dismantled the Aten temples down to their blocks and used them as filling inside his own new gateways at Karnak, where, hidden and protected, thousands of those blocks would wait to tell modern scholars the whole story. And the record keepers of the following age drew up their king lists to run smooth and unbroken from the dazzling sun straight to Horemheb, as though the horizon interlude. The boy and the old courtier had simply never reigned. Erasure again, the bookkeeping of legitimacy. And again, as with Hatshepsut, the stone kept what the lists dropped. Having no son, Horemheb chose as heir his trusted general, a capable man from a Delta military family, who took the throne as Ramesses, the first of that name. Remember it. The next chapter belongs to his grandson. Now come forward with me 3,200 years in a single breath, to the winter of 1922 of our own era, to that same dusty valley, worked over by then for 2 centuries by treasure hunters and archaeologists who agreed on one thing, that the valley was exhausted, every tomb found, every tomb long ago robbed. One excavator, Howard Carter, did not agree, and had spent season after fruitless season proving nothing, and was down to his final funded winter when his workmen, clearing beneath the ruins of some ancient workmen's huts, found a step cut in the rock. Then another. Then a stairway descending to a sealed door, and on the seals, a royal name. What followed has become one of the most retold moments in the history of archaeology, and it loses nothing in the retelling done quietly. A hole opened at the top of a second door. A candle put through, flickering in the escaping ancient air. A long silence from the man peering in, and behind him his patron, unable to bear it, asking, "Can you see anything?" And the answer, "Yes, wonderful things. Gold everywhere the candle found, strange animals, statues, the gleam of 3,000 years of dark." It took Carter and his colleagues nearly a decade to empty and record the little tomb. So dense was the treasure. Over 5,000 objects, the boy's golden mask among them. That serene inlaid face which has since become, for much of the world, the face of ancient Egypt itself. And of everything in the tomb, the objects most often remembered are not gold at all. On the brow of the second great coffin, someone had laid a small wreath of real flowers, cornflowers, and olive leaves, and blue lotus petals, still holding a ghost of their color after 32 centuries. And the excavators, hard men of a hard profession, wrote of it with open tenderness. Someone, at the funeral of a boy, had picked flowers. The season they bloom told scholars the season he was buried, spring going on summer, and the wreath told everyone something no treasury could, that behind the mask and the shrines and the ritual, a particular young man had died, and particular people had grieved for him, in the ordinary human way, with flowers. So the irony completed itself, and it is the kindest irony in Egyptian history. The great kings of this story built for remembrance on the scale of mountains, and were robbed, everyone. The minor boy king, tucked hastily into 4 small rooms and forgotten so thoroughly that even the erasers of the king lists did not think him worth much chiseling, was the one the valley kept safe. And the name that the ancient bookkeepers struck from the records is now, of all the names in 3,000 years of pharaohs, the one the whole world knows. A name spoken is a person remembered, the Egyptians taught, all the way back in chapter 4. By that oldest of Egyptian measures, the boy king, who asked for so little and was given eternity, 1. Evening comes to the valley, as it came the night they sealed him in, the cliffs going gold, then rose, then gray, the peak above holding the last light, the first stars over the western desert. Egypt, restored and steady, is turning below toward its next great age, an age of colossi and treaties and one enormous lifetime of a king. The boy sleeps, the river is in its bed, and one of the greatest builders of them all is about to be born in the delta grass. Chapter 19, Ramesses the Great and the Long Peace. Some rulers are remembered for a battle, some for a building, some for a book. The king at the center of this chapter is remembered more than anything for sheer scale, of reign, of family, of monuments, of self-belief. He ruled for 66 years. He raised more colossal statues of himself than any other pharaoh, so far as the surviving record shows. He put his name on so much of Egypt, his own works, and, in the frank manner of the age, the works of his predecessors too, that for centuries after, travelers could be forgiven for thinking the whole country had been built by one man. And yet the deed of his that has worn best, the one this chapter will keep at its center, was not made of stone at all. It was made of words on a tablet of silver. Peace. He was the grandson of that general Ramesses whom Horemheb had chosen, a Delta soldier's line come to the throne, and his father, Seti, gave Egypt one of its most admired short reigns. Order confirmed, the northern empire reasserted with measured campaigns, and, at sacred Abydos, a temple whose wall carvings are, by wide agreement among those who study such things, among the most beautiful reliefs ever cut in Egypt. The old classical grace revived after the Amarna storm and given one last perfect flowering. Seti raised his son beside him in the old 12th dynasty manner, and the son, crowned young as Ramesses II, came to power with energy, confidence, and a dynasty's point still to prove. The proving nearly undid him. In his 5th year, he marched north with the largest army Egypt had fielded in generations, 4 full divisions, to retake the contested city of Kadesh on the Orontes River from the Hittite Empire, the great rival power of the age. What followed became one of the most documented battles of the ancient world, because Ramesses spent the rest of his long life carving his version of it across the face of Egypt. Told calmly, and with the balance the king's own poets did not attempt, it goes like this. Deceived by planted informants into believing the Hittite army far away, Ramesses pressed ahead with a single division and made camp. The entire Hittite force was in fact waiting concealed behind the city, and its massed chariotry fell upon the strung-out Egyptian columns and then upon the camp itself. The surprise was complete. The second division broken, the camp overrun, and the young king, cut off with his household troops, did the one thing that saved the day and founded the legend. He did not break. He rallied what was around him and countercharged, again and again, holding the collapsing position by force of will until reinforcements arriving from the coast road struck the Hittite flank, and the day ended, after great loss on both sides, with the armies battered apart and the city untaken. It was, by any sober military reading, a narrow escape from disaster and a strategic draw at best. The Hittite records, discovered in modern times, claim it cheerfully as their victory. Ramesses went home and proclaimed, in text and colossal relief on temple after temple, the greatest triumph in Egyptian history, himself alone, abandoned by his troops, scattering the enemy by the thousands, with the strength of his arm and his father Amun. The scribes of Egypt copied the poem of the battle for generations. The border, meanwhile, stayed exactly where it had been. And here is why this story belongs in a chapter about peace. Because both sides, being great powers governed by serious people, quietly drew the same conclusion from it. 16 more years of seasonal campaigning followed, raids and sieges and shifting vassals, gaining neither empire anything durable. And in the king's 21st year, envoys traveled between the two courts, carrying something the world had rarely seen and has never stopped needing. Egypt and the Hittite Empire concluded a full treaty of peace and alliance, and we possess it, remarkably, from both sides. The Egyptian version carved at Karnak and the Ramesseum, the Hittite version impressed on clay tablets found in the ruins of their capital. The same agreement, mirrored, each king telling his own people that the other had asked first. Its terms ring with startling modernity. Eternal peace and brotherhood between the two lands. A mutual pledge of non-aggression. Alliance against attackers. The extradition of fugitives, with a humane clause that those returned were not to be harshly punished. And the gods of both lands. 1,000 of Egypt and 1,000 of Hatti, called as witnesses. It is, so far as surviving records show, among the earliest complete international peace treaties in the history of the world, and the parties kept it. They kept it for the rest of their mutual history. 13 years on, it was sealed in the old way of kings, with a wedding. A Hittite princess traveled south with a great dowry through the winter hills, and Ramesses, by his own delighted account, found her beautiful and made her a queen of Egypt. Where his grandfather's age had raised the capture of Megiddo, this age raised something rarer, and the silver tablet outshines the colossi if you weigh such things by what the world still needs. Peace, as we said of Hatshepsut, can be a policy, and Ramesses now ran it for over 40 years, and Egypt bloomed. In the eastern delta, near his family's home country, he built a new capital, Pi Ramesses, The house of Ramesses, by contemporary accounts a wonder of gardens, harbors, and gleaming halls, the throne of empire moved to the green north for a new international age, and everywhere, he built. He finished the enormous hypostyle hall at Karnak, begun under his father, a forest in stone, 134 columns, the great central one so vast that a circle of people with joined hands is needed to embrace one, their capitals opening overhead like papyrus in bloom. The whole hall built to hold shadowed, filtered light the way the marshes hold it, and holding it still. He raised his own vast memorial temple at Thebes, the Ramesseum, its fallen colossus, weighing on the order of 1,000 tons. Later ages' very image of magnificent ruin. And far to the south, in Nubia, he made the monument that shares first place in his legend with the battle poem, Abu Simbel. There, his builders did not raise a temple so much as reveal one, carving straight back into a sandstone cliff above the river, a facade of 4 seated colossi of the king, each some 65 feet tall, gazing east. And behind them, hall by hall, an entire temple driven 200 feet into the living rock, to a sanctuary where the king sits enthroned among the great gods of Egypt. Its axis was set with such care that on 2 mornings a year, and only 2, the rising sun reaches down the whole length of the mountain's interior and lays its light upon the seated figures at the very back. The Egyptians left no explanation of the dates. The fact of the engineering is explanation enough. Beside the great temple, he carved a second, smaller one, and dedicated it jointly to the goddess Hathor and to his chief wife Nefertari, whose colossi on its face stand equal in height to the king's own, a rare honor the inscription makes personal. For her, it says, for whose sake the very sun does shine. Nefertari's painted tomb in the Valley of the Queens is, by common consent of those who have stood in it, among the loveliest places in Egypt. The queen shone young forever on its walls, playing senet, adoring the gods. Her white gown so finely painted, you may see her arms through it. The Colossus King, it turns out, is also the source of some of Egyptian art's most tender surviving gestures. Scale and intimacy were never opposites here. They were the same devotion, at different distances. The rain ran on, through jubilee after jubilee, 14 in all, more than any other pharaoh of record. He fathered, by the count of his own monuments, on the order of 100 children. He outlived at least 12 of his crown princes, one after another, so that the heir who finally succeeded him, Merneptah, was himself an aging man. He outlived the friends of his youth, the veterans of Kadesh, the world of his coronation entire. 2 generations of Egyptians were born, lived full lives, and died knowing no other king. When he died at last, past 90 by the best estimates, it must have seemed to many along the river, in the phrase this series has earned the right to use, that the sun itself had gone down at noon. His mummy, by the way, survives, an aquiline old man with fine white hair, preserved by the devotion of later priests through adventures our next chapters will touch. Of all the great figures of this whole story, his is the face we can still, quite literally, look upon. Evening comes to the long rain the way it comes to a long summer day, slowly and without regret. At Pyramesses, the harbor lamps double themselves in the water among the reflected stars. At Karnak, the last light stands in the high, clear story of the great hall and goes out among the papyrus capitals. Far south at Abu Simbel, The four colossi hold the afterglow above the darkening Nile, faces the size of rooms, composed, expectant, facing the east out of which, on the appointed mornings, the sun will come all the way in to touch the king. 66 years are folded and put away. The treaty holds. The border sleeps. Egypt, at the close of this chapter, stands on one of the summits of its long story, and does not know, as we cannot help knowing, that the path ahead now runs gently, and then not so gently, downhill. The world around the summit is about to change, and the next chapter watches the lights of that world begin, one by one, to go out. Chapter 20. The Sea Peoples and the Slow Ebbing. Every evening of this series, we have watched a single land at dusk. This chapter asks something different of us, to watch dusk come over an entire world. For the Egypt of the great 18th and 19th dynasties had not flourished alone. It flourished as the senior power in a whole connected civilization, the great Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittite Empire in the north, Babylon and Assyria beyond the rivers, the merchant cities of the Levantine coast, Cyprus rich in copper, and the palace kingdoms of Crete and Greece across the sea. All of it laced together by the shipping lanes and the caravan roads, by the diplomatic letters of the brother kings, by dynastic marriages and treaty tablets, by grain and copper, tin and wine, songs and stories and fashions moving port to port. A merchant ship of the age, one of which was found in modern times where it sank off the Turkish coast, could carry in a single hull the goods of a dozen lands: copper from Cyprus, tin from far mountains, glass from the Levant, ebony from Nubia, amber from the distant north. That ship is this whole world in one hold. It was an old, rich, intricate system, and like many old, rich, intricate systems, it had come to depend on everything continuing to work. Around 1200 BC, roughly 3,200 years ago, over the span of a generation or two, it stopped working. What happened is one of the great questions of ancient history, and this series will honor it by not pretending to an answer the evidence does not give. The signs point many ways at once, and scholars now mostly speak of a convergence. Years of drought and failed harvests across the region, which the letters of the age themselves mention. Kings writing urgently to one another of famine and of grain ships that must not be delayed. Earthquakes in some places. The snapping, here and there, of trade routes on which distant kingdoms depended for the tin without which bronze itself could not be made. And moving through all of it, people. People in motion, in numbers, the settled kingdoms struggled to manage. Displaced, hungry, armed, families with ox carts and boats as often as war bands, pushed from their own failing lands, and pushing in turn on the lands ahead, a slow human landslide along the coasts of the Eastern Sea. The Egyptian scribes, trying to name the many bands and origins among them, called them, in effect, the peoples of the sea, and the name has stuck. The Sea Peoples, among history's most famous strangers, arriving out of the dusk of a failing world. Before them, and before the drought and the broken trade beneath them, the proud kingdoms of the north went down one by one, and the archaeology is quietly devastating. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's treaty partner, its capital abandoned, its records simply stopping. The merchant city of Ugarit, whose last clay letters, pleading that enemy ships had been sighted and the troops were far away, were found still in the kiln, never sent. The palace kingdoms of Greece, their citadels burned or abandoned, their scribes' art of writing itself lost in those lands for 400 years. Not everything died, and newer scholarship is careful to say so. Life went on in the villages there, as it had gone on in Egypt's own hard age long ago. But the system died. The brother kings, the letters, the treaties, the long-range trade, the world of Kadesh and the silver tablet. All of it went out like lamps down a corridor. Egypt did not go out. That is the headline of this chapter, and Egypt owed it to the old, deep advantages this series has followed from its first hour. The river that carried its own rain from Africa, the deserts that narrowed every approach, and to one more hard season of competent leadership. The migrations reached Egypt in force in the reign of Ramesses III, a king who had taken the great Ramesses' name as a program, and in his 8th year the crisis came as a double blow. A land column moving down the Levantine coast with its families and ox carts, and a fleet making for the delta mouths. The king met both, and his memorial temple at Medinet Habu, which stands today among the best preserved in Egypt, carries the record. The land force stopped at the frontier of the empire's remaining Asian provinces. The fleet lured and trapped in the narrow waters of the river mouths, where Egyptian archers lined the banks and Egyptian ships closed in. And the sea battle, among the earliest in history that we can see depicted in detail, ended in capsized hulls, and the migration turned. Egypt, alone of the great powers of the old order, held its heartland unbroken. We will let the reliefs keep the details, and keep for ourselves the quieter truth behind them. Many of the defeated were not executed but settled, enrolled as soldiers and planted in garrison towns. One more stream absorbed, in the long Egyptian way, into the river. Some of their descendants, settled along the coast north of Egypt, gave their name to the land there. The people history calls the Philistines, and through them the very name Palestine descend, most scholars hold, from one of the sea peoples of these years. But holding the door has costs, even when the door holds. The empire in Asia, its context gone, faded through the next decades to a memory. Nubia and its gold grew harder to hold. The grain-rich international trade shrank to a trickle of what it had been. And it is now, in the strained middle of the 12th century before our era, that this series can give you at last, in close-up, the village it has been saving for this moment. The place that shows us, better than anywhere else in Egypt, what ordinary life looked like while the great world ebbed. On the Theban west bank, in a fold of the desert behind the cliffs, lay a small walled village of some 68 houses, home for nearly 5 centuries to the hereditary crews who cut and painted the royal tombs. The place we now call Deir el-Medina. Because its people were, uniquely for a working village, largely literate, and because the desert kept their papers, we know them as we know almost no other community in the ancient world, not from proclamations, but from their own notes to one another. Tens of thousands of inscribed scraps of limestone and pottery, their work rosters and laundry lists, their letters and love poems, their sketches and jokes, their court records and dream books. We know the names of their foreman and their scorpion charmer. We know who was absent from work and why. The clerk recorded it. Brewing beer, it says, wrapping the body of his mother. Scorpion sting. His wife was giving birth. We know they sued one another over donkeys, adored their local patron saints, the deified Amenhotep I and his mother, whom we met at the close of chapter 13, still watching over the village 3 centuries on, and observed with relish their 2-day weekend at each 10-day week's end. We have their love songs, in which a young man calls his girl his sister, his one, the most beautiful of all, for whose voice he crosses the river unafraid of the crocodile, and their prayers, in which a workman, humbled by trouble, confesses his fault to the peak goddess of the cliff above, and thanks her for mercy. 3,000 years before anyone thought ordinary lives worth recording, these people recorded their own, because writing was their trade, and papyrus scraps were free. And it is from this village, in the 29th year of Ramesses III, with the state's granaries strained by the great world's troubles, that the record preserves one more first among the earliest documented labor strikes in history. The tomb crew's grain rations, their wages, fell weeks into arrears, and the crews, hungry and orderly, put down their tools, marched out of their valley, and staged sit-down protests at the memorial temples of the West Bank, saying to the officials, in words their scribe recorded, "We are hungry. 18 days of the month have passed, and we have come here driven by hunger and thirst. We have no clothes, no oil, no fish, no vegetables. Write to Pharaoh, our good lord, that we may be given our living." The officials scrambled, rations were found, the crews went back to work, the arrears returned, and so did the strikes, on and off for years, conducted on the evidence, without a hand raised on either side. A negotiation between a hungry village and an embarrassed state, in writing, as Egyptian a solution as exists. It is somehow fitting that the same records preserve both the strike and the love songs. The great powers of the Bronze Age had fallen around Egypt like towers. In the village, meanwhile, the questions remained what they had always been. The ration, the family, the neighbor's donkey, the girl across the river, the goddess of the peak. History has its scale. Life has another. After Ramesses III, the long 20th dynasty faded through a string of kings, most of them also named Ramesses, in reigns that grew shorter as the treasury grew thinner. The gold of Nubia faltering, grain prices climbing in the village accounts, the tomb workers' strikes recurring, and at the last, scandalously, the tombs themselves no longer safe. The papyri preserve the trials of the robbers, testimony and all. Piece by piece the crown's reach shortened, in the pattern we have twice watched before. And at Thebes, the real inheritor stepped quietly forward, the priesthood of Amun, whose god now owned, after 5 centuries of victorious gratitude, a great fraction of the land of Egypt itself, and whose high priests began to date documents in their own years and enclose their names, at last, in royal rings. The new kingdom, Egypt's high summer, ended as this series has learned such things end, not with a fall, but with an exhale. The court aging in the north, the god ruling the south. The empire a memory kept alive in temple reliefs of battles ever longer ago. Late in the age, a temple official named Wenamun was sent north to Byblos, on the errand Egypt had run for 2,000 years, to buy cedar for the bark of Amun. And the tale of his journey, whether report or literature scholars still debate, is the twilight of the age in one story. He is robbed in a foreign port, and no one fears Egypt enough to make it right. He waits, day after day, in the harbor at Byblos while the prince declines to see him. And when at last he is received and pleads the ancient greatness of Amun, the prince of Byblos answers, courteously and devastatingly, that yes, Egypt was once all he says, but times, as the envoy might have noticed, have changed, and cedar, as ever, costs money. Wenamun gets his timber in the end, after humiliations, and the tale breaks off with him still far from home. 2 centuries earlier, his king's name on a letter would have moved fleets. Now a harbor prince lets him sit. Empires end in many ways. Some end at Kadesh, with banners. Egypt's ended in a waiting room at Byblos, politely. Evening then, over the ebbed world, and let it be the village's evening, for they have earned the closing scene. The crews come home over the mountain path from the valley of the tombs, tools on their shoulders, in the long light, to the smoke of 68 suppers rising from the walled huddle of houses, and the peak above the village turns gold, the goddess in it watching, as the workmen believed, over the small courtyards where the love songs were copied and the strikes were planned, and the children were named after grandparents back 5 patient centuries. The great world has grown quiet around Egypt, its lamps gone out across the sea. Here, the lamps are lit at dusk, as always. The river endured, whatever failed elsewhere. The village eats and sings a little, and sleeps. And upstream and down, in the gathering dark between the priests of the south and the tired court of the north, Egypt's long afternoon slips quietly into its long, eventful evening. Many crowns will rise and fall in that evening, and strangers will wear some of them, and the story, as ever, is not close to over. Chapter 21. Divided Crowns. Priests, Libyans, and kings from Kush. When a great sun goes down, the world is not left in darkness. It is left in lamplight. Many small flames where one great light had been, each tending its own circle, each keeping something of the day alive. That is the Egypt of this chapter, the 4 centuries historians call the 3rd intermediate period, and we will walk it as lamplight deserves, without hurry and without mourning, because this age, so often told as decline, is also a story about how much of a civilization survives when its power does not, and about the surprising directions from which a flame can be rekindled. The division, compared with Egypt's older ruptures, came almost politely. At the end of the last dynasty of the Ramesses kings, the land settled, almost by agreement, into 2 spheres. In the delta, at a new city called Tanis, a line of kings ruled the north and carried the royal titles. At Thebes, the high priests of Amun governed the south in the god's name, and the 2 houses, often linked by marriage, treated one another as kin rather than rivals. Egypt had been divided by war before. This was something gentler and stranger. A kingdom quietly acknowledging that it had become 2 households of one family, writing each other's names with respect, sharing the river. The age was poorer than the empire it followed, and its monuments say so. The kings of Tanis built their temples largely from the reused stone of Pi Ramesses. The great city of Ramesses now slowly dismantled as its river branch silted, blocks and obelisks barged to the new capital and recut, the past itself become the quarry. But poverty is relative, and one modern discovery lets us calibrate it. In the year 1939 of our era, archaeologists working at Tanis found what almost no one believed still existed: royal tombs that had escaped the plunderers, the burials of the northern kings of this modest age, one of them, Psusenes by name, lying undisturbed in a coffin of solid silver with a fine gold mask upon his face. Silver, in Egypt, was rarer than gold, imported and precious. The find was, by any measure, magnificent. It made scarcely a ripple in the world's newspapers, for it was made in the very season the Second World War began, and so the second great intact royal treasure of Egypt entered history quietly, which suits both the king and the age, still golden, but in a minor key, and easily drowned out. And it is to this same modest age that we owe one of the most moving deeds in the whole long story of Egypt, one this series promised, 2 chapters ago, to tell. The imperial tombs in the Valley of the Kings, wealthy and famous, had begun to fall to robbers in the troubled last years of the new kingdom, and the priests of Thebes, lacking the power to stop the plundering, chose instead to rescue what mattered most. Quietly, over years, they gathered the great pharaohs from their violated houses, Sekenenre of the old Theban war, Ahmose the liberator, the Thutmoses and the Amenhoteps, Saite and Ramesses the Great himself. They rewrapped the mummies with care, labeled each in ink with its great name, docketing their work like the scribes they were, and carried them by night. We may imagine, up the cliff paths to hiding places prepared in secret. The principal one, a deep shaft tomb in the folds of the cliffs near Deir el-Bahri, where dozens of the mightiest rulers this story has known were laid side by side in a plain corridor. Kings who had commanded millions resting shoulder to shoulder like veterans in a shared barrack, safe at last, precisely because they now had nothing left worth stealing but themselves. There they lay for nearly 3,000 years, until a local family found the shaft in the 1870s, and the authorities traced the trickle of royal treasures back to it. And in the summer of 1881, the mummies of the great pharaohs came down the cliff paths again, in daylight this time, and were carried north to the museum by steamer. While, the story is told, the villagers lined the banks of the ancient river, the women wailing the old laments to see the kings go by. The priests who hid them had no way to know they were preserving those faces for a future that would learn to read every docket they wrote. They did it. Their notes make plain, as duty to the dead. It is because of their lamplit faithfulness in Egypt's dimmest century that we can still look on the face of Ramesses. The lamps multiplied as the age went on, and one of the steadiest of those lamps was held, through this whole era, by women. At Thebes, as the age advanced, one of the central powers of the south came to be not the high priest, but a princess, the god's wife of Amun, a daughter of whichever house held power in the north, installed at Karnak as the god's own consort on earth, celibate, immensely endowed with estates and clergy, her name written in a royal ring. Each god's wife adopted as her successor a daughter of the next ruling house, so that the office passed peacefully down the generations, above the quarrels of the princes, and Thebes was shaped, for the better part of 3 centuries, by a succession of these priestess-princesses, with their own courts, their own chapels, their own quiet diplomatic weight. When dynasties changed, it was often the adoption of a new god's wife, rather than any battle, that sealed the transfer of the South. The dynasty of formidable women this series met at the founding of the new kingdom had, in its way, outlasted the new kingdom itself. The last great powers of native Thebes were, to the end, royal ladies of Amun, holding the holy city with liturgy and landholding, while the crowns of the north changed heads. Into the delta, over generations, had settled large communities of Libyans, Westerners, who had come first as prisoners and soldiers of the late empire, and stayed as farmers and chiefs. And in time, in the manner this series has watched before with the Hyksos, their leading families simply grew into the country's ruling class, until a Libyan great chief took the double crown itself and founded a dynasty. The Libyan pharaohs ruled as pharaohs, in the full Egyptian style, and one of them marched an army into the Levant in the old manner and left his name on the old victory lists. But the deeper Libyan legacy was structural, a family habit of installing sons and cousins as high priests and local kinglets, which worked for a century and then did what such arrangements do, until the Delta was a patchwork of allied and rival princes, 4 of them at one point wearing royal titles at once, and Egypt, still prosperous, still entirely Egyptian in its temples and its habits, had almost ceased to be a single thing at all. It was then that the flame came back, and it came from the place this series asked you, long ago, to remember. Far up the river, beyond the cataracts, in the land of Kush, where Egypt had ruled for 5 imperial centuries, the empire had ended, but its ideas had not. Around the holy mountain of Gebel Barkal, which Egyptian priests had taught was a southern home of Amun himself, a Kushite kingdom had risen with its capital at Napata, African in root and speech and dynasty, and profoundly Egyptian in faith. Devoted to Amun, schooled in the old texts, convinced with the fervor of a student who finds the teacher's house fallen into disorder, that the true order of the world, the old Ma'at, was being neglected in Egypt itself, and that the duty of restoring it had passed south. In the later 700s before our era, the Kushite king Piye marched north with his army in a campaign he recorded on a great stela in prose so vivid and personal it stands apart from every other war record in Egyptian history. He pauses the campaign so his troops may purify themselves and celebrate the festival of Amun at Thebes. He accepts the submission of Delta princes and then declines to receive most of them in person, noting fastidiously that they were unclean. And in the one flash of open fury the text allows him, it is not a battle that provokes it. Entering a defeated prince's stables and finding that the horses had been starved during the siege, the king declares that of everything the man had done, it is this, the suffering of the horses, that grieves his heart most. Piye took the submission of all Egypt, and then, having set the crowns in order, did the most extraordinary thing available to a conqueror. He went home upriver to Napata, and never came north again. His successors reigned as the 25th dynasty, pharaohs of Kush and Egypt together, and the greatest of them, Taharqa, presided over a genuine renaissance. Temples repaired and raised from the delta to the deep south, old religious texts sought out and recopied. The archaic styles of the Old Kingdom revived in art, a colossal column of his still standing today in the first court of Karnak. And at home in Kush, the dynasty made one revival more, the most touching of all. They began to bury their kings under pyramids again, steep, small, and crisp against the southern desert sky. A whole field of them rising at the ancient cemeteries near Napata, and later far upstream at Meroe, centuries after Egypt itself had laid its last pyramid down. In the fields of Sudan today there stand, by count, more pyramids than in Egypt, smaller, younger, and devoted. The form this story watched born at Saqqara had traveled 1,000 miles up the river that carried everything and found its longest home there. Egypt's flame, carried south in the imperial centuries, had been kept, tended, and carried back north still burning. Civilizations, it turns out, can be stored. The Kushite restoration deserved a quieter century than it received. Its misfortune was its timing, for in these same decades the empire of Assyria, the iron military power of the age, was expanding toward the Nile, and after long contest, invasions ground south, and in 664 before our era, Thebes itself, inviolate Thebes, city of Amun, was sacked, an event that echoed in horrified proverbs across the ancient world for generations. The Kushite kings withdrew beyond the cataracts to their southern homeland, where their kingdom, still pharaonic in its forms, its pyramids, and its devotion, would endure in independence for another 1,000 years, one of history's great sequels watching from upriver. In Egypt, the Assyrians, stretched thin, ruled through native princes of the Delta. And from among those princes, in the usual way of this country, the next chapter of resurrection was already quietly choosing its family. Evening comes to the age of many lamps. At Tanis, the Silver King sleeps intact beneath the temple floor, keeping his secret through the wars to come. In the cliff shaft above Deir el-Bahri, the gathered pharaohs lie shoulder to shoulder in the dark, labeled in a librarian's ink, waiting out the millennia. Far to the south, past the whispering cataracts, the young pyramids of Kush stand needle-sharp under southern stars, and in the temple beneath the holy mountain, the evening rites of Amun are sung in the old language, word perfect, 1,000 miles from Karnak. The one great sun of Egypt is long set, but look how many flames, and how faithfully tended, and how far the light was carried. It remains only for someone to gather the flames into one lamp again. That story, Egypt's last great native morning, told in autumn light, comes next. Chapter 22, The Saite, Renaissance, and the Coming of Persia. There is an hour, late in a fine day, when the light turns amber and everything it touches seems both more beautiful and more precious, because the eye knows, without being told, that the hour is late. Egypt entered that hour now, and as if it also knew, spent the light in the loveliest way imaginable. It turned and looked back at itself. The reunifier came as Assyria's power ebbed homeward to its own troubles from the delta city of Sais, a prince named Psamtik, who began as one client ruler among several, and by patience marriage, hired ships and hired soldiers, and the fading of every alternative, gathered the whole country back into one hand. The fourth great reunification this series has watched, and the gentlest, accomplished more by administration than by war. The dynasty he founded from Sais gave Egypt a century and a half of independence, prosperity, and peace, the Saite age, and its character was fixed from the first. This would be a restoration not merely of the state, but of Egyptianness itself. For the Saites governed a country that was now, by any reckoning, old almost beyond comparison in its world, and they knew it, and they made antiquity itself the theme of the reign. Their sculptors went back past the empire, past the Middle Kingdom, all the way to the Old Kingdom masters 2,000 years gone, and copied them, sometimes line for line. Officials had themselves carved in the crisp, archaic style of the Pyramid Age. Scribes recopied the pyramid texts, 16 centuries old, into the tombs of Saite lords. Ancient titles were revived, ancient rituals researched and restored, the Serapeum galleries of the sacred bulls maintained with lavish piety, the monuments of Djoser and the Giza kings visited, restored, and labeled by antiquarian princes. Scholars have sometimes smiled at the Saite age, calling it backward-looking, an old civilization living on its memories. This series will not smile. A people that curates its own past is not asleep. It is keeping faith. The Saite sculptors' green stone portraits, smooth as water-worn pebbles, are among the finest things Egypt ever carved, and they were made by artists who had studied 2 millennia of their own tradition, the way a musician studies the old masters, not to hide in the past, but to be worthy of it. Egypt in its autumn became its own museum, its own library, its own devoted heir. There are worse things for a civilization to become, and this story knows most of them. Yet the Saite age was anything but closed. The same kings who revived the pyramid texts threw Egypt's doors open wider than they had been in centuries, because the world had changed, and Sais, a delta city looking seaward, understood the change. The future of power was naval, commercial, and Mediterranean, and its rising people were the Greeks. Greek merchants were granted a treaty city of their own in the western delta, Naucratis, with their temples and their trading rights, one of the first arrangements of its kind in Egypt, funneling Greek silver and wine and oil in, Egyptian grain and linen and natron out. Greek and Carian soldiers, the armored mercenaries of the age, took Egyptian service by the thousand, garrisoned the frontiers, and left, at Abu Simbel of all places, one of history's most human documents, scratched on the shin of a colossus of Ramesses the Great. A few lines in archaic Greek recording that the soldiers of one Saite expedition, having sailed far up the Nile, wrote this: the oldest substantial Greek inscriptions surviving anywhere, cut by bored soldiers on the leg of a king already 8 centuries dead. Greek travelers followed the merchants and soldiers and went home with their heads full. The debt Greek thought would owe to Egypt in mathematics, in medicine, in sculpture, in sheer awed sense of time, began accruing here in the amber light of Sais. And the Saite kings ventured outward in their own right. One, Herodotus tells us, commissioned Phoenician ships that set out south down the Red Sea and returned, more than 2 years later, through the straits at the far west of the Mediterranean, having sailed, if the tale is true, entirely around Africa, and reporting, to Herodotus's frank disbelief, that at the continent's far south, the midday sun had stood on their right hand, to the north, which is, of course, precisely what it would have done, the detail the historian doubted being the strongest evidence the voyage was real. The same king began cutting a canal to join the Nile to the Red Sea, linking, in ambition, the two halves of the world's waters. Autumn, in Egypt, was not drowsy. But the world of iron empires had not gone away. Assyria had merely been succeeded, first by Babylon, whose ambitions Egypt fenced with mixed fortune, and then by something larger than any empire yet seen. In the middle of the 500s before our era, the Persian Empire gathered up the entire ancient East, kingdom after kingdom, into a single realm stretching from India toward the Aegean. And in 525 BC, roughly 2,500 years ago, its king Cambyses brought his army across the Sinai, defeated the last Saite king, and added Egypt, the oldest prize of all, to the list of Persian provinces. Greek writers, gathering stories in Egypt generations later, told lurid tales of Cambyses the mad conqueror, mocker of temples, slayer of the sacred bull. Egyptian evidence of the time tells a duller and more instructive story of a conqueror who did what durable conquerors do, taking Egyptian throne names, honoring the goddess of Sais, burying a sacred bull with proper rites. We know this partly from one of the age's most thought-provoking men, an Egyptian admiral and priest named Ujehoresnet, who served the last Saite kings, then served their Persian conquerors, guiding Cambyses and his successor Darius into the forms of proper pharaohs, securing the restoration of his beloved temple institutions at Sais, and setting up a statue inscribed with his careful, dignified apologia. In a terrible time, it says in effect, I protected my people, I honored the gods, I made the foreigner into a pharaoh. Collaborator or preserver, the The debate is ancient and modern at once, and this series only observes that civilizations as old as Egypt survive partly through men like Uja, who decide that the forms must be kept alive whoever wears them, and partly through the other kind, who now enter the story because Egypt never stopped producing those either. Persian rule sat lightly at first, Darius proving one of Egypt's better foreign masters, finishing the Red Sea Canal, codifying Egyptian law, raising in the western oasis a great temple to Amun that stands today. And it sat heavily later, as revolts and repressions traded places across a century. It was in the middle of that Persian century, around the 440s before our era, that there arrived in Egypt a Greek traveler with an insatiable curiosity and a writing habit, a man from Halicarnassus named Herodotus, at work on a vast new kind of book, an inquiry, a history into the whole world of his day and how it had come to its present pass. He went up the river at least as far as Aswan, by his own account. He interviewed priests at Memphis and Thebes and Sais, pacing off monuments, collecting traditions, marveling and misunderstanding and recording with equal energy. And he devoted to Egypt an entire book of his work, the oldest surviving outsider's portrait of the civilization, because as he told his Greek readers, no other land possessed so many wonders, nor so many works beyond description. It was Herodotus who fixed in the world's memory the sentence that this series has, in its own way, spent every chapter unfolding, that Egypt is the gift of the river. His pages preserve stories, measurements, and priestly traditions we would otherwise have lost entirely, tangled, it is true. With tall tales he sometimes flags and sometimes swallows, and modern scholarship reads him the way we have learned to read every source in this story, gratefully and carefully at once. More than once already, when this series has said the tale is told, the teller was Herodotus. It seems only right, in Egypt's autumn, to name the guest at last. The first of the world's long line of visitors who came to Egypt to ask it questions, and went home changed. For Egypt did revolt, again and again, the old country proving hard to digest. And early in the 400s before our era, it broke free entirely. And for 6 final decades, a sequence of native dynasties, the last of them ruling from the delta city of Sebennytos, held an independent Egypt against repeated Persian attempts at reconquest, built superbly in the old manner, and gave the long line one final flourish. The last of these kings, Nectanebo II, was, though no one could know it, the last native-born Egyptian to rule Egypt as pharaoh. After him, the country would be governed by outsiders of one origin or another for more than 2,000 years. When the Persians at last broke through again, his kingdom collapsing around him, Nectanebo did not fall on his sword in the palace. He gathered his treasure and sailed south, upriver, past the cataracts, into Kush, where the pyramids still rose and the old faith burned, and there he passes out of history, the last pharaoh of the immemorial line, received, we may imagine, with honor, in the one place on earth still keeping all the old promises. Egypt's story, at its native end, flowed the way the water never did. South, home, upstream, toward its beginnings. The second Persian occupation was brief, bitter, and hated, and it has one distinction only. It set the stage. For far to the northwest, in these very years, a young king of Macedon was crossing into Asia with an army and an idea, unstitching the Persian Empire battle by battle. And in Egypt, province of that empire, temple and village alike waited to see what the world's newest storm would mean for the world's oldest country. Evening comes to the autumn kingdom, amber to the last. In the sculptors' workshops of Saite, the green stone faces smile their faint archaic smiles. 2,000 years of masters looking over the carver's shoulders. At Naucratis, the Greek harbor talk runs late over the wine, full of the news from the east. Somewhere on the shin of a colossus in Nubia, the soldiers' scratched letters hold the moonlight, and far beyond them, upriver, an old king without a country is welcomed by lamplight beneath steep young pyramids. The long native line has ended quietly, at 3,000 years less a little, and the land, which has outlived every one of its masters, waits with perfect composure for the next. He is coming by forced marches, and he is 24 years old, and the city he will leave behind him will carry Egypt's lamp into a new world. We meet him next. Chapter 23, Alexander and the City by the Sea. Where a river meets the sea, fresh water and salt do not simply collide. They mingle by degrees, in a wide braided zone that belongs wholly to neither, and is often the richest water of all. This chapter is the story of such a mingling, of how the old civilization of the Nile and the rising world of the Greeks joined at the river's mouth, and of the city they made together, where for 3 centuries the lamp of Egypt and the lamp of Greece burned on one wick. In 332 BC, roughly 2,350 years ago, Alexander of Macedon came down through Gaza into Egypt, 24 years old, already the conqueror of the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, and the Persian province of Egypt fell to him without a battle. The conditions favored it. Persian power there was thin, and many Egyptians had little reason to defend it. What is striking is not that Egypt yielded, but how it received him, and how carefully he understood what he was receiving. Alexander went to Memphis, the immemorial capital, and there did everything the last century of Persian rule had done too seldom. He sacrificed to the sacred Apis bull, honored the gods of the land, and was invested as pharaoh in the traditional forms, a Macedonian taking up, with every sign of genuine respect, titles that ran back past Ramesses, past Khufu, to Narmer at the beginning of things. The scribes wrote his names in the royal rings, where they look in hieroglyphs, no stranger than any other. Egypt had made pharaohs of Libyans, Kushites, and Persians. It knew how to do this, and did it now, one more time, with practiced grace. Then Alexander did 2 things that outlived him, and this chapter is really their story. First, he traveled west along the coast, and then inland, days across the desert, to the remote oracle of Amun at the oasis of Siwa, a shrine the Greeks had revered for generations as the seat of Zeus Amun. What passed between the young king and the god in the sanctuary, Alexander never publicly said. What emerged, in the telling of his companions and in his own conduct after, was that the oracle had greeted him as the god's son, and that he had been well satisfied with his answers. Greek writers would spend centuries weighing the politics and the sincerity of it, and this series will leave the weighing to them, noting only what the Egyptian priesthood surely noted. One of the most powerful men in the world had crossed a desert to be recognized by Amun, whom this story has followed from a modest Theban shrine, and had come away calling himself, as every pharaoh before him had, the son of the god. The old theology had fit the new age like a made garment. Second, before he left Egypt forever, he founded a city. On the Mediterranean coast, west of the delta, opposite a small island called Pharos that Greek sailors had known since Homer's day, Alexander marked out with his architects the lines of a new harbor city, and the story is told by the Greek biographers that lacking chalk they marked the streets with barley meal, and that birds descended in clouds and ate the flour, which the seers, recovering quickly, declared a splendid omen. The city would feed the world. For once, the seers underspoke. Alexandria, laid out on its grid between the sea and a freshwater lake, joined by canal to the Nile and by mole to its island, would become within a century one of the largest cities of the Mediterranean world, one of the greatest ports of the age, and something no city had quite been before. A deliberate world capital, Greek in speech, Egyptian in place, universal in appetite. Alexander himself never saw a street of it. He marched east that same year into the heart of the Persian Empire, and 8 years later, having conquered to the edge of India, he died in Babylon at 32, and his generals, after the manner of generals, divided the world. Egypt fell to the shrewdest of them, Ptolemy, who understood better than any of his rivals that a defensible, wealthy, self-feeding country was worth more than any dream of reuniting the whole, and who secured his prize with one of the age's boldest acts of royal theater. As Alexander's funeral cortege traveled west from Babylon, Ptolemy met it, and by arrangement or by hijack, brought the conqueror's body to Egypt, where it was enshrined at last in Alexandria, in a tomb that became the New World's holiest secular shrine. Kings and later Roman emperors would visit it for centuries. The founder became the foundation, and Ptolemy, in due course, took the crown outright, first of a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 275 years, every king of it named Ptolemy, down to the daughter who ends our story. The Ptolemies ruled as double beings, and the doubleness is the key to their age. Seen from Alexandria, they were Greek kings of the grand Hellenistic type, presiding in Greek over a Greek-speaking court and administration. Seen from the temples of the interior, they were pharaohs, and not neglectful ones. They were crowned at Memphis by Egyptian rites, endowed the priesthoods richly, and built and rebuilt the temples of the old gods on a scale the new kingdom would have respected, in the old style, covered in hieroglyphs, staffed by Egyptian clergy. Indeed, and travelers today are often surprised to learn it, the best preserved great temples now standing in Egypt, at Edfu, at Dendera, at Kom Ombo, at Philae the Pearl of the River, are mostly Ptolemaic buildings, the last flowering of Egyptian temple architecture, raised under Greek kings, and so well made that they have outlasted nearly everything older. The two worlds met in the middle, too. A new god, Serapis, was furnished blending Osiris and the Apis bull with the bearded majesty of Greek Zeus, and prospered in both communities. Greeks settled and married up the whole length of the valley. Egyptians learned Greek and entered the administration. And in the temple scriptoria, the priests, writing now for an age that asked new questions, compiled and copied and defended the old knowledge with a scholar's devotion. One of them deserves this series' particular gratitude, an Egyptian priest named Manetho, who, early in the Ptolemaic age, wrote in Greek a complete history of his own country from the beginning, organizing the kings into the 31 numbered dynasties that every history of Egypt, this one included, has used ever since. When, long ago in our 12th chapter, we mentioned a later Egyptian historian who told the Hyksos story as catastrophe, it was Manetho we meant. His book survives only in fragments quoted by others, one of the library's 10,000 losses, but its skeleton became the spine of Egyptian history forever. The last priests of Egypt, among their other services, wrote the index to the whole 3,000 years, and over all of it, in Alexandria, burned the two lights for which the dynasty is best remembered. In the palace quarter, the early Ptolemies founded the Museum, a shrine of the Muses in name and in fact, one of the ancient world's first great state-supported centers of scholarship where salaried scholars from the whole Greek world lived, dined, argued, and worked, and attached to it the library, with its famous ambition to collect, by purchase, copying, and outright confiscation from ships in harbor, every book it could reach, hundreds of thousands of scrolls at its height, by ancient report. What was done there, in a few generations, still shapes much of the intellectual world we inherited. Euclid, in Alexandria, organized geometry into the textbook the world used for 2,000 years. The librarian Eratosthenes, hearing that at midsummer the noon sun shone straight down a well at Aswan while it cast a shadow at Alexandria, used the distance between the two, the geometry of shadows and nothing else, to calculate the circumference of the entire earth, and came, by most modern reckonings of his units, astonishingly near the truth. A man measured the planet with a well, a shadow, and the length of Egypt. Astronomers there mapped the heavens, and one, ahead of all evidence, proposed that the earth circles the sun. Physicians founded scientific anatomy. Grammarians, editing Homer, invented the critical scholarship of texts. And 72 Jewish scholars, by the tradition their community cherished, rendered their scriptures into Greek in Alexandria, the translation through which those books would travel into the wider world. And at the harbor mouth, on Pharos Island, the dynasty raised the light itself. The great lighthouse, a tower of white stone rising, by the ancient descriptions, on the order of 400 feet. Its fire at the top mirrored out to sea for the grain fleets, counted among the 7 wonders of the world, and so identified with its island that in language after language around the Mediterranean, to this day, the word for lighthouse is some child of the name Pharos. The city Alexander marked in barley meal had become the place where the ancient world went to know things, a library with a harbor, a lamp for ships, and a lamp for the mind, both burning all night. It was not, this series being honest to the end, a golden age without shadows. Alexandria's brilliance was paid for by the Egyptian countryside, taxed and managed by the most thorough revenue system the ancient world had seen, and the villages of the valley knew the museum mostly as a distant expense. Native Egypt rose in revolt more than once, and for 2 decades the Deep South seceded under rebel pharaohs of the old blood before being brought back. And the ruling family itself, after its brilliant first century, began to turn its ambitions inward, brother against brother, queen against king, with a domestic ruthlessness that became a byword even in a ruthless age. The dynasty aged the way its city did not. The lamp of Alexandria burned steady while the hands that held it shook. And beyond the sea, tide by tide, a new power was rising in the west, a republic of farmers and soldiers with an appetite for grain and a genius for arriving, whose shadow begins to fall across the last pages of this story. Evening comes to Alexandria as it comes nowhere else in Egypt, off the sea, with gulls and salt. In the library quarter, the lamps are lit among the scroll racks, and a scholar reads Homer beside an Egyptian priest, writing king lists in Greek. Down at the harbor, the great tower kindles its fire, and the beam swings out over the darkening water, past the grain ships riding at anchor, toward the sea roads of the world. And far to the south, up the long river, the old land keeps its own evening as it has kept it through every chapter of this story. The temples of Edfu and Philae glowing at their rites, the villages at their suppers, the Nile at its patient work, indifferent, as ever, to the language of its masters. One lamp of Egypt now burns by the sea, and one burns up the river, and for a while longer they burn together. the last hand to hold them both will belong to a woman whose name the whole world knows, and her story, the last of our journey, is next. Chapter 24, Cleopatra and the Last Sunset. Every long journey deserves to end at the sea. Ours ends there now, at Alexandria, in the last century before our era, with the last ruler of the last dynasty of one of the oldest kingdoms in the world. And because her story has been told so often as scandal and so often as tragedy, this series will try to tell it as what, from the river's point of view, it truly was: a completion. 3,000 years of pharaohs come down to a final scene by the sea, and it is a scene, as so many of Egypt's best scenes have been, about intelligence, about devotion to a land, and about the turning of a tide too large for any single life to hold back. By the time she was born, in 69 BC, the world of the early Ptolemies was long gone. Rome, the rising shadow of our last chapter, had become the fact of facts, mistress of nearly the whole Mediterranean, devourer of every kingdom Alexander's generals had founded, and Egypt, the richest prize of all, survived not by strength, but by a careful, expensive dance. Purchasing Roman patrons, avoiding Roman pretexts, feeding Roman markets, the last great independent kingdom of the Greek East, and everyone knew it was last. Her father held his throne by Roman favor and Roman loans. Her childhood palace was a place of debts, coups, and wary embassies. It was, whatever else one says of it, an exceptional education. And she was an exceptional student. The propaganda of her enemies, which is the source of so much the world thinks it knows of her, made her a seductress and little more. The fuller record, read patiently, shows something rarer. Cleopatra, seventh of the name, was, by the serious accounts that survive, formidably intelligent and formidably worked. A ruler who, first of her whole dynasty in nearly 3 centuries, so the tradition records, troubled to learn the Egyptian language of her subjects, and spoke, the same tradition says, many languages besides, receiving embassies from Ethiopia to Parthia without interpreters. A monarch who steered Egypt through famine years with grain decrees that survive on stone, managed the currency, rebuilt the fleet, and was honored in the Egyptian temples not as a foreign queen, but as the goddess Isis made manifest, the great mother of the old religion, whose worship she embraced with what the evidence suggests was real conviction. Her coins, minted under her own authority, show a face not of legendary beauty, but of character. Strong-nosed, keen-eyed, alert. The ancient writer who knew the traditions best put it plainly enough. Her beauty, he says, was not in itself incomparable. It was her presence, her conversation, the play of her mind and voice, that no one who dealt with her escaped. She ruled for over 20 years, in the hardest circumstances any pharaoh ever faced, and it is time, this series believes, that she was remembered the way Hatshepsut has come to be. As a working monarch, in her case the last and among the most skillful of a line 3 millennia long, her reign's story is inseparable from Rome's civil wars, and we will keep our promise of subdued drama and tell it as the turning of great wheels. Driven from her throne at 21 by her brother's courtiers, she was restored by Julius Caesar, who arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rivals and stayed to arbitrate Egypt's. The story the world loves, that she had herself carried to him rolled in bedding, comes from the old biographers and may be embroidered, but it is perfectly in character for a queen whose genius was the well-judged entrance. Alliance became partnership. She bore a son she named Caesarion, Little Caesar, and Egypt, for a few years, stood safe in the shelter of the most powerful man in the world. Then Rome's wheel turned, as it would keep turning. Caesar was assassinated, the Roman world split again, and its eastern half came to be commanded by Mark Antony, who summoned the Queen of Egypt to answer for her loyalties. She answered with the most famous arrival in ancient history, sailing up the river to him at Tarsus in a barge of gilded stern and purple sails, silver oars moving to the music of flutes, herself adorned as the goddess of love. So the great biographer describes it. And the meeting she staged as theater became the second partnership of her life, and the longest. A decade of alliance, marriage in all but Roman law, 3 children, and a shared design in which Egyptian wealth would underwrite Antony's Roman power, and Antony's Roman power would guarantee Egypt's future. The last real strategy available to the last independent kingdom, played by its ablest hand. It failed, as we know, and they could not, because the final wheel of the Roman Republic turned against them. Antony's rival Octavian, Caesar's cold and gifted heir, made their partnership his weapon, painting Antony to Rome as a man unmanned by an Eastern queen, and the queen as Rome's great foreign enemy. And when war came, it came as one battle at Actium off the western coast of Greece in 31 BC, where the fleets met and the allied cause, for reasons the sources dispute to this day, broke. Cleopatra's squadron quit the line. Antony followed her, and the war was over in the leaving, whatever the tactics behind it. They returned to Alexandria and held it, and the winter courts of that last year have a strange glitter in the sources, feasts of a society that styled itself now the companions in death. And in the summer of 30 BC, a little more than 2,000 years ago, Octavian's legions reached the city. Antony, defeated at the gates and deceived by a false report of the queen's death, ended his life in the Roman manner and died, the tradition says, in her arms. Cleopatra, taken alive, bargained for her children's futures, took the measure of the conqueror through one last cold interview, and understood that Octavian intended her to walk in chains in his triumph, the last exhibit of the last kingdom. She declined. On a day in August, having bathed and dined and sent a sealed message to Octavian, she was found dead upon a golden couch, royally dressed, her 2 waiting women dying with her, one still adjusting the diadem on her mistress's brow. The story the whole world knows says an asp, an Egyptian cobra, was smuggled to her in a basket of figs. The oldest sources themselves confess the truth was never established, and the conqueror's men, arriving too late, found only the quiet room and the composed queen. However the door was opened, she went through it as she had lived, on her own terms, dressed as Isis, cheating Rome of its show. She was 39. Octavian, who could not parade her, paraded her statue, granted her, with the strange respect enemies sometimes keep for each other, burial beside Antony, killed her son Caesarion, for 2 Caesars, his advisors observed, were one too many, and annexed Egypt, not even as an ordinary province but as his personal estate, the granary of the emperors. The line of the pharaohs, which began before history with Narmer's 2 crowns, ended there, in a sealed room by the sea, after very nearly 3,000 years. And now, before we close, this series asks you to do what it has asked all along. Step back from the palaces and look at the land. For from the river's point of view, the point of view we adopted in our very first chapter, the fall of Cleopatra was an event, but not an ending. The flood came that summer as it had always come. The villages planted the black land as the water fell. The temples of Edfu and Dendera and Philae kept their rites, and the Roman emperors, on their walls, are carved as pharaohs, offering to the old gods in the old poses, their Latin names spelled carefully in the royal rings. One more line of foreign kings absorbed into the immemorial forms. The priests went on writing hieroglyphs. The embalmers went on wrapping the dead. Isis of Philae gathered worshippers from all over the Roman world, and Egypt fed Rome as it had fed itself, from the same fields, by the same rhythm this story began with. The old civilization did not stop at Actium. It ebbed, the way its own river ebbs slowly over centuries, as new faiths rose and old endowments failed, until at the Temple of Philae, on an island at the far southern threshold of the land, in the late 4th century of our own era, a priest named Esmet Akom carved beside a figure of a god a few lines in the sacred script of his ancestors, a birthday inscription for the god Mandulis, with a note in his own hand. And so far as anyone has ever found, that quiet graffito, cut some 400 years after Cleopatra and more than 3,000 after the signs first spoke beside this river, is the last hieroglyphic inscription ever written. The words of the god, born in chapter 4 among the labels of kings, ended their immense career on an island in the Nile, in the hand of a working priest, marking a festival. Then the script slept, unreadable for 1,400 years, until a stone found by soldiers in the delta town of Rosetta, carrying one Ptolemaic decree in 3 scripts, gave a young French scholar the key. And in 1822, Champollion cracked the code, and the signs began to speak again, all of them, everywhere, at once. Sinou prayed his way home again. The schoolboy's proverbs turned back into sense. The dockets of the priests who hid the pharaohs became legible, and this series, and every telling like it, became possible. Egypt, which trusted writing above all things to defeat time, was right to trust it. A name spoken is a person remembered. You have been speaking their names all along. So let the sun go down now, one last time, the whole length of the land. It leaves the sea first, and the empty palace quarter of Alexandria, where the lighthouse will burn for centuries yet over harbors full of Roman grain ships. It leaves the delta, the marshes standing black against the west, the villages of the Black Land at their suppers as they were in chapter 2, as they are, in truth, this evening. It leaves Memphis of the white walls and the pyramids on their plateau, Khufu's mountain catching the very last of the light as it has caught it, by this evening, some 1.5 million times. It leaves Amarna's empty bay, and Abydos of the ancient kings, and 100-gated Thebes, where the 2 colossi sit facing the darkened east, and Hatshepsut's terraces go blue in the dusk beneath the peak. It leaves Philae last, the island temple glowing on the darkening water at the threshold of Nubia, where the last words of the old script wait patiently for Champollion. And then the land lies in the dark, all of it, all 5,000 years of it at once. Under the same stars the herders watched from the green Sahara before Egypt began. And through the middle of the darkness, north, past every ruin and every village, every chapter and every age, the river goes on, gleaming faintly, carrying the silt of Africa down to make tomorrow's fields, absolutely unconcerned, world without end. We began this journey with water, grass, desert, and the slow gathering of people along the Nile. We end it the same way, because that, beneath the crowns and the colossi, is what Egypt always was, a river and the people who loved it, and the long, patient conversation between them, of which every pyramid and every poem in this story was a single sentence. The kings are asleep. The signs are speaking. The flood is coming, as it always was. Thank you for traveling the river. Sleep well.